Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and on such a distinguished panel with Drs. Maccabee, Chip Knappenberg, and Anthony Watts, whom you all have heard of. Actually, some of the material that I'll be putting up has made its debut on the Anthony Watts What's Up With That, so some of it will seem familiar, but not all, I hope, I expect. Okay, first of all, I should say that the program has my affiliation and email incorrect. The correct information is right here. I'm an independent scholar, and my email is, there it is. The other thing is that I have a lot of material, so I'll be going quite fast. And what I'll be talking about is global warming policy, and mortality rates. An alternative title that I was thinking I might put down here was, has global warming policy killed more people than it has saved? And I'll try to shed some light on that. Now, I have to say that a lot of the stuff that's being done on global warming is pretty iffy. And so one should take the numbers that are generated with a pinch of salt. But my approach in a lot of this has been to take a look at what is it that the global warmists, if I may use that term, say, and see what are the logical consequences of the information that they've generated. And that's how I've approached this whole thing. Okay, so let's proceed. My talk is organized around, first I'll present some empirical data on excess winter deaths, extreme events, etc., etc. Then I will try to rank global warming amongst other global health risks. And finally, I will talk about the issue of potential death and diseases in developing countries from biofuel production. And the reason here is that a good part of the impetus for biofuel production comes from the perceived need to do something about global warming. Okay. Here I have data on daily mortality rates by month for various industrialized countries. And as we can see, that in the colder months, whether it is in the northern hemisphere or in the southern hemisphere, the mortality rate is higher. In the northern hemisphere, the colder months are December, January, February, and March. And in the southern hemisphere, that's these two, New Zealand and Australia, they are June through September. And what that tells us is that more people die during the colder months than in the rest of the year. And what this actually begs the question, what this begs the question is that if there were to be global warming policies, the question is that actually going to save lives or cost lives? And I think it's a very simple question, and it ought to be answered before anybody says anything about global warming policies and the need for them. And I see this as a collective failure of the medical community to point this out, because this is not news. This is one of the oldest, this is a pretty long-stand finding. It used to be once upon a time, summertime was a bad time, because there would be mosquitoes and stuff like that. But we've gone away from that for decades. Okay. This is a calculation of excess winter deaths in various developed countries. And for each of these, we see that there are more deaths in winter than at any other time of the year. For the United States, for the year 2008, this is all empirical data. It's taken from the National Vitality Statistics Survey. 108,000 people died. There were 108,000 excess winter deaths in 2008. And you can go down the list. Even Cyprus. Cyprus is not a particularly cold country. It's right in the middle of the Mediterranean. And it's not all that far from the coast of Africa. And even there we have excess deaths. The difference between Cyprus and the United States, the major difference is the population size. I don't remember what the population of Cyprus is, but it is pretty small compared to the US. And we can see that these are quite substantial numbers. When we take a look at long-term trends, this is for England and Wales, and I expect that virtually every country will have a very similar profile. We see that excess winter deaths have actually declined substantially. And this is most likely due to the fact that we are wealthier and fuel has become much more affordable, housing stock is better, and these are all adaptations that people have made, and it has benefited everybody. But the really important thing is not just that it has declined, and it's declining because we have become wealthier and fuels become more affordable, but the real thing is that there are still excess winter deaths. That is the fundamental issue that people need to have to deal with. Okay, we see that malaria has shrunk from, and it used to be virtually around the world in the middle of the 19th century, and today we have this. It's shrunk quite a bit. What we don't show here are the rates, because in the past the rates were quite substantial. Okay, one of the things we are told by global warmists is that as the globe warms, agricultural productivity will drop, particularly in developing countries, and that will create more hunger and so on and so forth. So let's look at trends in chronic hunger. We see that from the late 60s to the 2000s, there was a decline in the percent of population that was chronically hungry. This is data from the Food and Agricultural Organization. And then in the early 2000s, it started going up again. So perhaps global warmists have a point. But unfortunately, unfortunately for them, unfortunately for the rest of us, we see that yields have actually kept going on regardless. These are yields for the least developed countries, and this is yields for the world, and so has production gone up. So whatever has happened, it hasn't happened according to the scenarios laid out by the warmists. Productivity has gone up, and in fact, for whatever reason hunger is going up, it is not due to poor crop harvests. And this entire slide, except for the logos, is taken from the Food and Agricultural Organization's own State of Food Insecurity, not report. They had an accompanying slideshow, and that's where I pulled this out from. Okay, and one of the things that they point out is that it is the food price crisis, global economic slowdown, insufficient investment in agriculture, which in some ways you got to kind of look askance at because it's actually begging for more money. And, but one factor is, well, I'll come to that. One factor is going to be biofuel production. Okay, when you look at it much more broadly and for a longer period of time, I have here, I show from 1760 to 2007. Okay, what we see is that we are getting wealthier. That's the red line here. Population is increasing, which is supposed to be a bad, okay, and in many people's judgment. Carbon dioxide, green line here, that's gone through the ceiling. Despite that, we're all living longer. So what does this tell us? It tells us that whatever produces, and it's quite possible that whatever produces carbon dioxide emissions and the wealth may actually be working together to kind of help. It's not directly or indirectly we are managing to do something right because life expectancies have gone up. And it's not only that life expectancies have gone up, everybody is living longer, and we're also living healthier. If you take a look at data for, if you take a look at data for health-adjusted life expectancy, which essentially discounts life years that are spent in a disabled or diseased condition, we find that today's health-adjusted life expectancy exceeds the unadjusted life expectancy from a few decades ago. That's the single best piece of information that one has to tell us that we are living not only longer, but healthier. And this is stuff that I don't produce. I just use information that's produced by the World Health Organization on that. Okay, let's rank global warming risks. Now, in the absence of context, even the smallest molehill can be made to seem like a Mount Everest. So the thing is, let's put some context in it. Let's compare how many people are supposedly dying from global warming and how many, and what is the burden of disease for global warming as well as a bunch of other risk factors. All the data here has been taken from a 2009 study done by the World Health Organization called the Global Health Risks, and there's a long subtitle to that. But essentially what this tells us is that on the basis of the burden of disease, global climate change is last out of 24 risk factors. And if you take a look at the mortality burden, it is second last. So, and this is why I think it's always critical to establish context. One of the things I find most discouraging in the policy business is that there's virtually never any context. Now, the first thing that I do when I do an analysis, I try to find out how big a problem are we talking about. And what this tells us is that according to the analysis that has been done, this is not a big problem. There are many other problems that are a lot more important. And whatever money we spend on this one should be matched by the amount of resources we are willing to spend on the other ones. Okay, let's now talk about potential death and disease in developing countries from biofuel production. I'll do this very rapidly, so forgive me if I'm a little, if I don't explain precisely what it is that I'm doing. Okay, I start with the Global Health Risk Report, which is done by the World Health Organization. And what I do is I take a look at the ratio of the disease burden per capita for low-income countries, and I compare that with the ratio of the disease burden per capita for lower middle-income country. So what I'm doing is I'm looking at the disease burden for the poorest segment of countries and the next poorest segment of countries. And if I see that the ratio between these two is high, my assumption is that that is because of the fact that one segment is poorer than the other. So based on that, I say that if the ratio is greater than 5.0, then it is a disease of poverty. And it kind of makes sense. Okay, global climate change is one of them. Underweight, that's very similar to not having enough food, going hungry. It's not that alone, but there are other factors that can impinge upon underweight. Zinc deficiency, vitamin A deficiency, unsafe sex, I think that's supposed to be AIDS and company, and unsafe water, sanitation, etc. So I'll just look at those 6. Now I could have expanded this list all the way to number 10 through iron deficiency, but I am trying to get a lower bound estimate, not an upper bound estimate. Because usually you find that if you do that, the lower bound estimate is good enough to get you there. Okay, so based on that, I calculate, I use the global health risk data to figure out how many people died from diseases of poverty. That's 7.7 million in the year 2004. And the disease burden was 267 million from those 6 categories. And then what I do is, okay, this is for the year 2004, because that's the data for which the WHO report was undertaken. Now, next, what I do is I try to figure out how many people were in extreme poverty, according to the World Bank data. I have to do some adjustments because they changed the method of measuring and the thresholds, etc. And I get about 1.5 billion people were in extreme poverty in 2004. So now I have the number of deaths, 7.7 million people for 1.5 billion people in extreme poverty, okay? And 267, which gives me about 5,000 deaths per million people in extreme poverty. And for the disease burden, it is 183,000 lost dailies per million people in extreme poverty. I've done this for the year 2004. I've matched up the deaths to the extreme poverty numbers, assuming that they are consistent. Now, then I have data from the world, also from World Bank research studies that tell us that in the year 2010, that's this year, what they were trying to do was trying to figure out how much poverty would increase because of the fact that biofuel production has diverted crops from food to fuel. Okay. Because of that, there would be a 32 million increase in the number in absolute poverty, and then I used that to convert it to increases in deaths, potential increases in deaths and potential increase in burden of disease. And I find that 51,000 people, there's a potential 51,000 people that are dying or will be dying in 2010 because of the biofuel production, driven in part by global warming policies, and the burden of disease would be 1.3 million, additional burden of disease. So let's see what we have. For the year 2010, we have 51,000 dying because of biofuel production. According to the World Health Organization study, 141,000 people died in 2004 because of warming. Okay, now let's look at this. If biofuel production actually reduced global warming, the chances are that its benefits did not filter down, because it takes a long time for emission reductions to be manifested as temperature changes. So the chances are that virtually none of these 141,000 lives were saved by the year 2010. On the other hand, I have a slightly greater confidence that poverty does actually kill people. So we are looking at 51,000 potential deaths versus some very small fraction of 141,000. And I think this, if you take a look at the probabilities, etc., it's a hand-waving argument, I'll grant you that, still would exceed a small fraction of the number of people that have been saved because of reduced greenhouse gas emissions because of biofuel production. Okay, so let's summarize. Okay, what are my findings? In the developed world, more people die in winter, but trend is downward. Deaths and death rates from extreme weather events, malaria, hunger, etc., have declined. Therefore, they have helped mortality rates decline, life expectancies increase. Global warming ranks below the top 20 global health problems today and will advance only if we deal with the higher level risks first. Death and disease from biofuel production more likely to be real than those estimated due to global warming. And increased death and disease from biofuel production most likely exceeds any reduction from reduced warming. Conclusions. Global warming or its underlying human causes, if any, have not increased death and disease in the aggregate. That is based upon empirical data. You can take it to the bank. In fact, they are probably responsible for the worldwide decreases in mortality rates and increases in life expectancy over the last century. Global warming policy may already have killed more than they have saved, and may kill even more if they reduce energy use prematurely and/or economic development, particularly for the less well-off. Thank you.